How do you double the value of a communist car? You fill the tank. These 5 cars are so hilariously bad you have to take a look at the situation with a sense of humour. People in Soviet Russia had to save 11,000 rubles, which is £106,000 today, walk into a car dealership and pay up front, only to hear that the delivery date was in 10 years' time. Then when the car finally arrived, it was comically bad. Poorly designed, unreliable, and many of them were pretty weird. So why were the Soviet Russians so bad at making cars? This is a new series, The Scrapheap, where we talk about cars that are so bad they belong in the scrap heap, straight from the factory. But before we get to the worst 5, how did it get to a point where a car costs an absolute fortune and the wait time could be measured in decades rather than weeks? Well, what we now know as Russia was a strange place in the 60s and 70s. It was under communist regime and the government placed a heavy priority on its military, meaning all of the best scientists, engineers, designers, machinery and materials all went straight into the country's war efforts, rather than working on making good cars. On top of this, the production of cars was heavily regulated, where the government held control of what cars were imported, which were made, who could buy one, and how many cars were offered out. But as we will see in this top 5, the cars were produced to be bare bones, take you from A to B runabouts. They weren't allowed to be luxurious in any way, and they had to last for years and years. So let's say you're a hard-working person in Soviet Russia and you have saved and saved for years to buy a car. Well, actually getting the opportunity to buy one of these awful cars was really tough. The government regulated the allocation of all cars, where they would distribute a certain number of cars to each company. Then it was up to the bosses to choose who got one. And even if you were Employee of the Month, that wasn't enough. Companies put employees through interviews and only gave cars out to the hardest working and most valuable employees. Oh, and being a member of the Communist Party certainly didn't hurt your chances of being chosen. Then, after all that, you placed your order for an insanely overpriced relic of a car and could wait anywhere between 4 and 10 years before it came. But what this meant was that the demand was so high that the various Soviet manufacturers didn't really need to innovate. They kept on making hilariously out-of-date cars for decades. And then, even if they did want to improve or upgrade a model, they had to run it by the government. And as you can imagine, this wasn't a quick process. And here's where we get to our number 5, the Volga 24. And this car is not especially awful relative to many other Russian cars, but it sums up the communist car industry well. Look at this, a 1975 Volga 24. Then look at these European cars from the very same year. This Volga was stuck in the 60s and showing no sign of changing. It had a long wheelbase and very robust suspension for the awful Russian roads, but unsurprisingly, no power steering. Driving this thing was a workout, so much so that it was nicknamed the Barge. It was released in 1970 and was mostly untouched until 1977, where Volga released an updated version, the 2410. And you would have thought this would come with a modern redesign, maybe things like power steering, central locking, or maybe even fuel injection, all things that were commonplace everywhere else. But no. The government really weren't wanting better cars, they just wanted more of them. So what they did was further simplify production by essentially making the car worse. They replaced the engines with cheaper versions that produced less power, as well as replacing chrome trim with plastic, all to streamline manufacturing. There was one cool thing about this car though. It could be spec'd with a 5.5 litre V8. Not a good V8, but a V8 nonetheless. But these versions were largely kept for Soviet officials rather than the general public. They got a 2.5 litre instead. But to be honest, this was a good thing, because if you could afford to buy the car, you often couldn't afford to put the fuel in it. There were very few fuel stations where you could get hold of some outrageously overpriced fuel. But naturally, there was a black market for this petrol. You just had to know the right people. Oh, and not get caught. And that situation explains our next car, made with the sole purpose of being extremely cheap and good on petrol. The Hugo 45. It was a front-wheel drive, front-engine, 3-door hatchback made in Yugoslavia, another communist state. And like many other communist cars, it was based on a European model and then adapted for the communist market. Things like stronger suspension and swapping out parts for cheaper versions. The Hugo was based on the Fiat 127, a car that was actually pretty good. However, the communists completely ruined it. Firstly, it was made to be very, very cheap, only $8,000 in today's money for a new car. So there were lots of corners cut in the manufacturing process. It was incredibly unreliable. The interior was made from cheap plastic that loved to crack, and the steering wheel was so wobbly that people said the car had a mind of its own. It had a 1.1 litre 4-cylinder engine that produced 55 horsepower, which was actually enough for such a light car. And they had so little rust treatment from the factory that they often got a bit lighter over their life. But what was interesting was that for some bizarre reason, the US imported them as a cheap base level car that sold well due to its low price, only for it to be widely regarded as one of the worst cars ever. It was incredibly unreliable, and unsurprisingly, the workforce that made the cars were mainly military. The majority smoked while working and drank brandy on lunch breaks. The materials were bought solely based on price rather than quality, and the factories were absolutely filthy. It's unsurprising that the list of common faults is so extensive. And on to number 3. This thing is more of a tent than a car. It's called the Velorex. Whether it's Velorex or Velorex, I'm not sure, but it's actually pretty cool. It's a clever, if unusual, answer to both the fuel shortage and the rising steel prices in communist Czechoslovakia at the time. It was made with a whole load of motorcycle parts, including the engine, which produced a mighty 8 horsepower. 8 horsepower. But the entire car weighed a tiny 290 kilograms, thanks to its light space frame and that the body panels aren't really panels. It was vinyl stretched over the frame. Now these were actually surprisingly popular, as they were made as specialist cars for the disabled, and so they were often heavily reduced or even given away for free. The Russians had an equivalent car, and of course it was much worse. It was called the SMZ and was technically a microcar, and again was only popular because they were basically given away for free to those that the government deemed needed one. And this explains why almost no effort went into the design or development, with lots of people saying that they essentially scaled up a toy car to life size. They weighed 500 kilograms, which is actually quite a lot for such a small car, and only had a tiny 356cc engine. They were hopelessly slow, maxing out at 34 miles per hour, if the dodgy Russian roads allowed that sort of speed, or the engine didn't overheat. They were made from 1974 all the way up to 1997, a time when we had the Mini. The difference in quality, styling and space is obvious. But the most striking thing is the design. It's almost so bad that it's kinda cool. So now on to our number 1. And what could be worse than the last iconic collection of cars? Well, the Trabant. Now these were mainly made in Soviet East Germany, and it was an answer to the car of the people from West Germany, the Volkswagen Beetle, but a sort of communist remix, and therefore obviously worse. Launched in 1957, it was a 4-seater that was strangely made from a material called Duroplast, made from recycled cotton waste. It was kind of similar to fiberglass, relatively light and strong, but mainly chosen due to it not having the same cost or shortage as steel did. It also came with the benefit of not rusting. Well, whilst the shell didn't rust, everything underneath it did. But that's beside the point. And for a long time, it was one of the most sought after cars in East Germany, essentially being the best of a bad bunch. But it meant that the average wait time from order to delivery was 15 years. To put that into perspective, imagine having ordered a BMW 3 Series 15 years ago. That means that today, an E90 would have shown up. Still new, but already dated. It had a 2-stroke 600cc engine that was reliable, but well known for smoking a lot. This was down to the 2-stroke fuel separating after being parked for a while, and the car mostly burning oil rather than fuel for a couple of minutes after startup. It was very softly sprung for the bad roads, but so much so that if you had passengers in the back, the nose would point up so far that you would have to adjust the headlights to be able to see. They were made from 1957 all the way up to 1991, and were well known for how basic they were. It was extremely loud and very, very slow, not to mention how chronically unreliable it was. But it's not just that the Trabant was awful in 1957. It was that it was essentially left untouched until 1991, where it was even more terrible. You should watch this video where we unpack why new cars keep on failing the moose test. Thanks very much for watching this episode of the Scrap Heap. You should subscribe to make sure you catch the next one in the series and check out those terrible cars. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.